In the period leading up to Japan's defeat in World War II, the empire underwent a rapid rise as a military power in Asia and the Pacific. Its earlier successful conquest campaigns, such as the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the expansion into Southeast Asia from 1941 onwards, granted it extensive colonial power. Inspired by the expansion model of Nazi Germany, Japanese leaders sought to emulate its effectiveness in achieving their goals. However, despite these conquests, Japan made crucial tactical errors that ultimately led to its defeat. The strategy of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, while initially successful, failed to neutralize the Pacific Fleet and triggered the United States' entry into the war. Furthermore, attrition tactics like the use of kamikaze attacks did not weaken the Allies' resolve, but rather strengthened their determination to fight to the end. Join us in this new installment of military history to explore the details from the Japanese perspective during the war and the reasons that led the Nation of the Sun to its crushing defeat. Let's begin. World War II, although officially began in 1939, had its roots much earlier in the geopolitical scene. For Japan, the starting point can be traced back to 1931, when the Imperial Army seized Manchuria, a strategic region in northeast China. This move was driven by the desire to expand its territory and secure natural resources to sustain its growing economy and military ambitions. However, to fully understand the context of expansion in Asia, it is essential to go back to 1894. In that year, Japan emerged victorious from the First Sino-Japanese War, gaining significant territorial concessions from the weakened Chinese Empire, including Formosa, now known as Taiwan, and the Pescadores Islands located off the western coast of the neighboring empire. This conflict marked the beginning of a new era for Japan, which came to be recognized as a regional power in Asia. The territorial acquisitions of 1894 set a precedent for imperial expansionist policy in the region. As the country continued to modernize and strengthen its military, its territorial ambitions intensified. Decades before the outbreak of the Second World War, the confrontation with Russia in 1904 and 1905, known as the Russo-Japanese War, had marked a significant turning point in the empire's territorial expansion in Asia. This war was primarily triggered by disputes over influence and control in Korea. The annexation of Korea in 1910 represented another major step in imperial expansionism. This action placed the archipelago under direct control of the Nation of the Sun and further expanded its influence in the region. Additionally, at the end of the First World War in 1918, Japan gained administrative control over the German islands in the Pacific as part of the peace settlement. In the years leading up to the consolidation of the Third Reich and before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Nation of the Sun continued to consolidate its control over strategic regions such as Indochina and Thailand. This pattern of gradual yet steady expansion, combined with growing nationalism, created the perfect conditions for conflict. The Second World War was not merely the result of isolated events, but the climax of decades of imperialist ambitions and geopolitical tensions that finally erupted. As the conflict intensified in Europe, the United States adopted a policy of neutrality, avoiding direct involvement. However, in December 1941, everything changed when Japan launched a surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This event precipitated America's entry into the Second World War. The Nation of the Sun did not necessarily need a masterstroke to win, but rather a smarter strategy. It is known that the military forces had strong control over the government, and military and political elites shared a deep-seated belief in the superiority of the Japanese nation and its right to dominate other nations. This expansionist ideology was coupled with domestic discontent, as many working classes suffered from a low standard of living, while large corporations sought new markets and raw materials to sustain their economic growth. Japan's strategic location in the heart of the Asia-Pacific area, as well as its formidable navy compared to other nations, further fueled its ambition. All of this contributed to an atmosphere of aggression and militarism that culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. But before this crucial event in the global geopolitical realignment, let's analyze the Japanese imperial perspective amidst the rise and consolidation of Nazism. The Japanese were easily led due to various factors rooted in their culture and society. First and foremost, the highly organized worship of the state and its symbol, the emperor, was promoted as a means to unify the people around a total war effort. Although this official idolatry of the state was relatively recent, compared to Japan's millennia-old empire, it was based on beliefs and values that the Japanese had held for centuries, such as the human desire to possess the property of their neighbors, elevated to a patriotic and religious duty. Additionally, the universal education system and the propaganda press facilitated the transmission of these ideas, capitalizing on the population's docility and deep-seated respect for authority. In Japanese culture, loyalty to the country and obligations to the nation were emphasized, while individual rights received little attention. The members of the Japanese high oligarchy took control of the island through a series of historical and political events. Initially, the Japanese Constitution of 1889 established a monarchical system in which the emperor played a predominant, albeit symbolic, role. The real power lay in the hands of an elite of nobles, military personnel, and politicians who wielded significant influence over government decisions. The honor of bearing arms, which had always been considered a badge of the superior man, was extended to the entire nation. The blend of emperor worship with the glorification of war, coupled with continuous victories over half a century, bestowed upon the army and navy a popular prestige that would be difficult to destroy. During the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany, there was a degree of sympathy and cooperation between Japan and the Third Reich. Both totalitarian states shared some ideological and strategic aspects in common, which facilitated a certain degree of collaboration. Both the Third Reich and the Japanese government promoted the superiority of their own race and sought to expand their territorial dominance at the expense of other nations. The modern Japanese army admired and imitated the Germans. Its officers considered themselves heirs of the ancient samurais. Most of them were poor, proud of their service, and fanatically devoted to the emperor. By 1930, there was serious discontent within the armed forces. The worldwide economic depression severely affected Japan, causing much hardship among poor farmers, who were largely recruited into the army. There were many failures of small businesses and severe unemployment among industrial workers. Authorities were alarmed by the spread of Western political ideas, especially communism. Their own political philosophy was not very different from Hitler's National Socialism. To lift the nation of the sun out of the depths of the economic depression, a vigorous program of social, economic, and political reforms was needed. In response to this, the military had a plan in mind: to forcefully expand into China, aiming to overcome the empire's dependence on foreign trade. Additionally, they planned for a military dictatorship with the emperor as a nominal figurehead. In 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, impacting its credibility and its role in maintaining world peace.
Nations meets at Geneva to vote on the report holding Japan responsible for the conflict with China over Manchuria. Before the vote is taken, Mr. Matsuoka of Japan delivers a final address on his country's behalf.
The League of Nations, established in 1919 after the First World War, aimed to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and international cooperation. However, its effectiveness was limited by the absence of powers like the United States and the lack of its own military force. Japan's withdrawal following condemnation for the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 further undermined this organization, demonstrating its inability to prevent military aggression. On November 25, 1936, Germany and Japan signed the so-called Anti-Comintern Pact, with the goal of forming an alliance to defend themselves against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Despite its apparent strength, the Berlin-Tokyo Axis alliance was more fragile than many might think. Although both countries had much in common politically and militarily, they never truly behaved as genuine allies. On August 23, 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact through their foreign ministers, Ribbentrop and Molotov, which bewildered the rest of the Western powers as it seemed unnatural. The reason for this strange union can be found, on one hand, in Hitler's haste to secure peace on the Eastern Front for the duration of the war, and on the other hand, in Stalin's need for a powerful ally during his international isolation. This non-aggression pact included secret clauses where both countries reserved various spheres of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Among these was Poland, which would be divided into two zones following its invasion, one German and one Soviet. This agreement posed a series of dilemmas for the Japanese Empire. It meant a betrayal of the anti-communist alliance between Germany and Japan, undermining Hitler's trust and credibility as an ally. On the other hand, the pact implied that Germany was no longer willing to support the nation of the Sun in a potential conflict against the Soviet Union in Asia. Furthermore, the division of spheres of influence in Central and Eastern Europe between the Nazis and the USSR included strategically important territories for the empire. It is unlikely that any nation would risk its very existence in a war unless it perceived an opportunity to win. However, a formidable army, brimming with enthusiasm and efficiency, can be a powerful temptation for a government prone to confrontation during a crisis. Japan possessed the most powerful navy and air force in the Far East. Additionally, it had highly trained personnel and modern weaponry, providing it with a strategic advantage. This was further bolstered by its chain of naval and air bases in mandated islands, territories under Japanese control after World War I, and optimally positioned for southward expansion. Between 1937 and 1941, Japan's costly involvement in the war in China resulted in financial losses and significant casualties. Despite this, the empire anticipated substantial gains from its investment, supported by the availability of strategic natural resources in China and its ambitions for expansion in Southeast Asia. These reserves, including oil, coal, and metals, were vital to fueling Japan's war machine and supporting its expanding economy. By the fall of 1941, the nation of the Sun had reached the pinnacle of its military and naval power, backed by these ambitions and strategic resources. With Great Britain and Russia facing Axis triumphs in Europe and Africa, and other Western powers unable to defend their eastern possessions, only the United States Navy posed a significant threat to Japan. High-ranking military and political leaders of the empire, known as the warlords, were tempted by a crucial opportunity to carry out a surprise attack to incapacitate the Pacific Fleet, specifically at Pearl Harbor Naval Base. This fateful decision marked a turning point in world history, as it led the country into open war with the United States and its allies. Although the surprise attack by the Japanese Empire's navy is often considered nearly perfect, there were critical errors that allowed the United States to regain momentum in the following months. On the other hand, the Allies missed several opportunities to detect the Japanese siege due to incorrect communication and inadequate preparation. The bloody resistance on each Pacific island recaptured by the Americans, including the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Palau Islands, proved counterproductive. Despite Japan's expectation to wear down the Allies with high losses, this only served to increase Allied determination and strengthen their commitment to the conflict in the Pacific region. The initial strategy of the Nation of the Sun was affected by several setbacks that altered the course of the war. Although the initial invasions, including that of the Philippines, were successful, The attack on Pearl Harbor did not achieve its primary objective, neutralizing the U.S. fleet. The aircraft carriers, fundamental pillars of the Navy, survived the aggression and remained intact. Although the siege of the American port was precise and spectacular, ultimately it did not weaken the United States. On the contrary, it infuriated and strengthened their counterattack. Despite this, Japan decided to continue its conquests in the Pacific, relying on its naval superiority. However, the crucial battle at Midway Island completely changed the landscape. The Americans, anticipating Japanese movements, ambushed the Imperial fleet and managed to sink their 4 main aircraft carriers. This victory was a turning point, balancing the warship game between both powers and allowing the Allies to accelerate the production of new armaments.
Con el ataque a Pearl Harbor, la flota estadounidense quedó fuera de juego durante 6 meses y Japón pudo moverse a sus anchas por el Pacífico. Sin embargo, pasado ese tiempo, Estados Unidos recuperó su fortaleza y mostró su poderío tanto en Europa como en el Pacífico.
Similar to Germany, Japan envisioned a quick and decisive victory, underestimating the potential of a prolonged conflict that would require massive military manpower production. Despite boasting one of the most formidable navies before the conflict, the Imperial Navy faced near annihilation by the end of the Second World War at the hands of the United States fleet. Japan's miscalculation arose from the false belief that the Americans were weak and would retreat from defending the Pacific Islands. During the final years of the war, after Pearl Harbor, the attritional air battle demonstrated Japan's inability to match the United States in producing highly trained pilots and developing increasingly advanced aircraft. With the loss of air supremacy to the Americans, Japan faced the reality that it could no longer effectively control the sea surrounding the Pacific Islands. Japan's only opportunity to change the course of the war would have been to develop a superweapon like the atomic bomb, and the means to deliver it to the North American mainland. However, the opposite occurred when the United States developed and used the atomic bomb against Japan in 1945, devastating the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led the empire to surrender. This was announced by Emperor Hirohito to his citizens, marking the end of World War II in the Pacific.
帝国の現状とに鑑み、以上の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し、ここに重要なる汝臣民に次ぐ秦は帝国政府をして米英四蘇四国に対しその共同宣言を
Japan's surrender was formalized on September 2nd, 1945, when Japanese representatives signed the surrender documents aboard the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. This act ended nearly 6 years of war in the Pacific and marked the beginning of the Allied occupation of the island, which would last for several years and have a profound impact on the country's reconstruction and restructuring. Despite some initial successes, Japan's expansionist ambitions ultimately led to its defeat. That concludes the report. If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to share it so that more people can delve into the details of the defeat of the Japanese Empire in World War II. Thank you for joining us until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installment of Military History.